Penguin Random House Audio presents Reclaiming the Black Body, Nourishing the Home Within. This is the author, Alishia Mccullough, LC, MHC. This book is dedicated to all of the versions of myself that courageously and continuously took the road less traveled, allowing each unknown step to unfold into my own becoming. This book would not have manifested without the favor and wisdom of God, Goddess, my ancestors, and my birth and chosen families. This is for my fellow healers and culture shifters, and all of those who dream and live with liberation in your hearts. We collectively birth this work. Author's note. There are times when it feels like the universe knows a culture shift is necessary, so it creates conditions that challenge us to transform. I believe the events of 2020 were our wake-up call. None of us could have predicted that both a global pandemic and a series of senseless killings of Black people at the hands of a system whose job it is to protect us would become conduits for change. But each brought to light social ills we could no longer ignore. COVID-19 cut a swath through our country that year, leaving a trail of chaos, uncertainty, and grief in its wake as we all grappled with many unknowns about the virus, and with the millions of lives that we eventually lost. One would think that this unique experience we were all going through would have brought us closer together as human beings. But the same anti-Black indoctrination I'd seen in my work as a mental health therapist not only continued to pop up, but appeared to get worse. When articles began to appear that questioned why COVID death tolls were higher in Black communities compared to other races, the narrative immediately became that our higher rates of health issues were to blame. It was also suggested that this phenomenon was happening to us because Black people are, quote-unquote, overweight or, quote-unquote, obese. Once again, the onus was placed on us to debunk these myths. Many Black folks in the field had to point out the poor healthcare options in low-income jobs are really what had put Black communities at higher risk. Those who had access to money, transportation, and social capital were better able to isolate and to call out from work or work from home. But for those living in low-income Black communities, that wasn't an option. Having to use public transportation to get to work, for example, forced people to put themselves at risk as they exposed themselves to areas where the virus was highly transmittable. During this time, the white-dominated eating disorder field chose to deal with COVID by focusing on helping people feel better about their pandemic weight gain. The internet was full of messages that said, it's okay that you put on a few extra pounds. After all, we are in a global pandemic, as if being in a pandemic was the only acceptable excuse for someone to gain weight. As some of us folks in the field tried to call attention to and deal with the racial disparities connected to COVID, another crisis took over our communities: the terrorism and murders of Black folks by the police and racist people. I remember waking up every day in survival mode, holding my breath as I watched the news to see who had been harmed this time. The constant barrage of police brutality and other racist incidents had many of us feeling isolated, hopeless, and burned out. Toward the beginning of the pandemic, I made the decision to leave a job where the impacts of systemic and personal racism were literally holding my nervous system in a constant state of hyperarousal. For the first time in my life, I did not have a plan, so I took a job in a group private practice with the hopes that I could pick up a bit more income during this tumultuous time. As the pandemic and racial trauma persisted, I felt that my work as a mental health and eating disorder therapist must also include speaking out against social injustice and oppression. I needed a space where I could share my voice and my experiences so that I wouldn't feel like I was constantly screaming into an echo chamber. This was around the time when Black therapists who spoke up about racism in my field stood out like unicorns in a stable of white horses. When I first got into this work, I was one of 4 Black eating disorder providers in my area. And out of those 4, I was the only one who was using language like decolonizing, eating disorders, and discussing the implications of trauma, racism, and oppression showing up in our bodies. There were many times when white eating disorder providers questioned my competence. and whether I deserved to be in the field at all. Because I challenged the status quo. I consistently spoke out about the impact of cultural issues and embraced a holistic view when discussing healing. Still, I and a few courageous others put ourselves and our careers on the line to tell the truth about our experiences in the industry. This, I should also mention, was around the same time that an eating disorder conference was scheduled to be held on a slave plantation. Whenever we talk about issues we and our clients of color were experiencing, we were often dismissed, silenced, and labeled as being too controversial. A white provider even told me that I was taking too much of a granular lens and that I needed to focus on the standard, which in her mind was the white, thin women who were being represented as having eating disorders. As my colleagues and I pushed back and refused to conform to the way things had always been, many of us were blackballed. Still, we continued to advocate for systemic and institutional change for our clients and ourselves. This growing tension between those of us who were challenging the status quo and those who were working overtime to uphold it came to an inflection point in 2020. As police violence towards Black bodies became endemic, it was hard to show up in my Black body every day and deal with my own fears, uncertainty, anger, and grief, and frustration with the state of affairs in America, while also having to show up and hold space for clients who shared their personal trauma and grief associated with the war on Black bodies. From the pandemic to police brutality. At the time, I had a white supervisor and did not feel safe discussing the nuances of what it was like for me to wake up in terror, wondering if the Black men in my life were going to make it to where they were going, or if friends and family could contract a deadly virus because they didn't have the option to work from home. It was hard to talk about how I was holding in my body not only my own grief, but the rage of my ancestors and the myriad feelings of my Black clients every single day, session after session. It was hard to talk about the white people who just discovered that racism existed and were now purposefully seeking out Black therapists to help them process and work through their white privilege. Having to hold space for white people to become undone in confidential therapy sessions while we ourselves were not okay added to our trauma. We were forced to compartmentalize in order to show up. It was a lot and often too much. The breaking point for me, the murder of Botham Jean. Jean was a 26-year-old accountant who was killed by an off-duty Dallas Police Department patrol officer named Amber Geiger. Geiger entered his apartment in Dallas, Texas, allegedly claiming she had confused it for her own apartment. She said she fatally shot Jean because she thought he was a burglar. I remember sitting on the couch in my living room speechless as the news circulated through the media. During a time of the pandemic when we were being mandated to stay inside and had curfews for when we could and could not leave the house, here was a situation in which a Black man minding his own damn business was killed in his own home. Yet, the media centered the story on the white woman's perceived fear. There was little to no show of concern for how Jean's life, dreams, and future had been cut short. A few weeks later, we learned about the circumstances surrounding the death of Ahmaud Arbery, who was murdered by two white men in a racially motivated hate crime while jogging. He was simply existing and moving his body while Black. There was a flurry of other killings, Tony McDade, Breonna Taylor, and then the murder that caused an international uproar and countless uprisings, George Floyd. It was all too much to process. These murders received widespread press, but there were many more that we did not hear about. I had clients showing up for sessions who were telling me how they were tased, gassed, and or arrested for protesting, or worse, that they had lost a loved one to police violence or a hate crime. It was devastating. I was afraid and I felt powerless. As an outlet, I began to post on Instagram about what was happening in the world and speaking out even more about the intersections of racial trauma and eating disorders. I felt that racism was at the epicenter of eating disorders, yet that conversation was completely missing from my formal education and work environments. And so, I created a social media page centered on eating disorders and anti-racism. It attracted a lot of Instagram followers who were dietitians and traditional eaters.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?